Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations, one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Ireland has long been associated with the policy of military neutrality, but today that principle is being tested and in a new and complex ways, from cyber threats and hybrid warfare to pressures for deeper defense cooperation with the EU and NATO. Ireland is facing questions about how neutrality fits into a rapidly changing security landscape. At the heart of this discussion, there is a fundamental question. How can Ireland safeguard its sovereignty and identity as a neutral state while contributing meaningfully to European and global security? My guest today is Ken McDonagh. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Ken McDonagh is Associate Professor of International Relations at the School of Law and Government, Dublin City University. His research focuses on EU foreign policy, the common security and defense policy, and the intersections of gender and international security. First question, and I think this is something very interesting, because when I speak with students, not many students even know that Ireland is not a NATO member, because it's Western Europe, so it automatically fits into that narrative. So Ireland has historically adhered to a policy of military neutrality. How is this principle being reinterpreted in the context of current European and global security challenges? And how do you, as a professor with deep research in security studies, see this narrative of neutrality?
That's a great question, and really great to start with that point that Ireland is an unusual state, that when you look at it, it's Western oriented, it's deeply integrated into European institutions, it's transatlantic, it's very engaged with Washington, D.C. as well. So from the outside, it looks like an obvious candidate for NATO membership. Obviously, military neutrality has historical roots in Ireland, and there's some debate about how far back we need to go to explain it. But the short version, at least when it comes to NATO, is that Ireland decided not to join because of the ongoing dispute with the United Kingdom over Northern Ireland and the six counties. There was an initial approach by the Irish government that if we would have Irish unification, then we would consider NATO membership. And that was just seen as not an issue the Americans wanted to get involved in. So in the post-war era, we found ourselves outside of the two camps, at least formally. Now, the perception of Ireland's neutrality is probably interesting in that context, because for the Soviet Union, they recognised Ireland as essentially another Western state. They held up our membership of the United Nations on that basis. And if you look at Ireland's voting pattern at the UN, we were very consistently voting with the Western Bloc. The one slight outlier would be our work on non-proliferation, but even then we worked with a number of both NATO and other neutral European allies in that context. So Ireland's approach to military neutrality has been interpreted by our successive governments quite narrowly. Essentially, it means we're not a member of NATO and we're not a member of any other formal military alliance. It's been stated quite explicitly by the current government and by previous governments that military neutrality and political neutrality, as they phrase it, are different things, and that politically we are aligned with the European Union. For example, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we were very much on the side of Ukraine, critical of Russia's violation of international law, and strongly supportive of, for example, European Union membership for Ukraine. Where we drew the line, and this is where the tension in the debate emerges, I guess, is in terms of formal military support. So even when it came to the European Peace Facility, for example, Ireland organised a sort of a carve out so that the money being donated from Irish funds would only be used for non-military ends. Now, how that's interpreted is it does include things like fuel. It includes things like helmets for soldiers, but not artillery, not ammunition, and not things like that. So what our government has tried to do is maintain that distinction between military neutrality and political neutrality. And where the debate in Ireland is at the moment is the extent to which that's consistent. So critics of the Irish government would say that they've sold out on Irish neutrality, that de facto we are another member of the Western Alliance, And we're trying to sort of just cover up that this has happened from the Irish people because the neutrality is extremely popular when you look at public opinion. And that's echoed as well by the Russian state. So the ambassador to Ireland has been quite explicit as well that Moscow does not see Ireland as neutral in the contemporary conflict. And I think similarly, if you're looking at the conflict in between Israel and Palestine, the Israeli government would not view Ireland as particularly neutral in that context either.
We are recording this episode during a discussion or debate about the Irish national security strategy. Why is national security strategy important if it's clear that Ireland is military neutral?
I mean, a discussion and debate is probably putting it quite strongly. I think there are people like myself and people involved in the policy and practitioners circles where this is being debated. I think if you stopped someone on the street and asked them, is there a debate about Ireland's national security strategy? They would look at you in a quite confused way. So it's recognised as important by experts, by people with something in play when it comes to security policy. Now, the full national security strategy has been promised since 2019. And it was sort of a move in response, I think, to the 2016 EU global strategy and how Ireland would rethink its security and defence in that context. We don't actually have a national security strategy at the moment and have never published one. And that's a major gap in debates about defence and security. What's open at the moment or is just closed are the public consultations for the maritime security strategy. And this is a problem in the Irish context that we are in some ways engaged in institutional reform and decisions about investment and decisions about future capabilities without having a clear doctrine or statement of strategy on which to build that and on which to have an open debate. So, for example, we had for a period a National Security Analysis Centre that has been folded now into an internal secretariat within the Prime Minister's department, the Taoiseach's department. So there are all these sort of little reforms going on and decisions about defence procurement happening absent a clear strategic statement. Now, there's obviously internal documents that are guiding this, but it raises some questions about oversight and policy robustness, not having a public national security strategy. So in terms of why we feel we need one, it's to create that framework so that we can start to build a security culture and a culture of debating where Ireland's security interests lie.
As a professor and academic, you have that critical lens. So do you see any drivers / pressure powers behind this debate? Or is it sort of like more theoretical debate of the experts that Ireland wants to develop sort of a comprehensive security strategy and that's it? So it's like purely expertise / national security or there is something behind it?
I think the very obvious thing is the external context and the shifts in that external context. And there's a number of factors going on, two of which we can locate back in 2016, which is the first Trump presidency, and of course the vote for Brexit. And both of those, I suppose, one of the criticisms of Irish military neutrality for a very long time is that we were kind of free riding on NATO security provision, and largely because we lived in a fairly benign geopolitical part of Europe, we were able to get away with it. The Trump presidency, to one extent, and Brexit to a greater extent, shook that complacency to a degree and made Ireland realise that actually now we need to make decisions about how we think about our security. And I think that started a lot of the debate, particularly as it fell in line with the development of the EU global strategy, the shift towards strategic autonomy, what became the strategic compass, later on as well. So there's that external environment has changed, and there's expectation from our European partners that when they ask Ireland questions about its maritime security, when it talk about things like cybersecurity and hybrid war, about information war, given the headquartering of such a large number of global social media companies, their European headquarters are here in Dublin. So Ireland needs to have adequate responses when our partners look for these questions. So I think it's that external pressure that is really driving the debate. There isn't a groundswell or shift in opinion in among the Irish public, and I don't think there's a real perception that we need to respond to an overt threat, which is an interesting. It's very different to Central Europe or to the Baltic states. or even to other states that have a stronger public tradition of debating security.
To what extent that debate counts with the military neutrality as a concept? Will this security strategy shift in some way, or do you think that neutrality as a concept will be a core of this security strategy?
One of the interesting things about the Irish debate is there are no serious political actors arguing for a change or a shift away from military neutrality. What there is a debate, or where the line of division tends to be, is to what extent is military neutrality compatible with engaging with NATO's Partnership for Peace, or engaging with PESCO, or engaging with European Union battle groups. And to what extent is that a betrayal of neutrality? So you find the opposition parties, Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, other parties of the left, and some of those of the right, who would say that this is the government sort of pretending to the Irish public that it's maintaining the same policy, but really shifting the goalposts quite significantly under the hood, so to speak. So I think in terms of any emergent national security strategy, I would expect to still see military neutrality as a central plank, but rather an argument for greater engagement to address capability gaps that have been identified through processes like the Commission on Defence, which reported in February 2022, which was an expert-led commission organised by the government largely to address retention and pay issues within the Defence Forces, but took a broader remit to look at basic capabilities, what would be required for Ireland to have an operational capacity in its own security and defence.
I think people might logically and naturally ask if this strategy is not going to be the first step to join NATO.
I think they will, and you'll find that question asked, quite vociferously and sometimes quite loudly in Irish political debates.
Or maybe I can rephrase it slightly: that is there any political power or party that is pursuing the NATO membership in Ireland?
No, is the short answer. And what you'd find, there might be a small number of members of Parliament who would privately tell you that they would like Ireland to move towards a NATO path. There's a small number of academics who might make that argument as well. But there isn't a sort of a serious political movement. We just had an election in November 2024, and in all of the party manifestos, there's a statement of commitment to military neutrality. What the national security strategy is likely to say in that context is a restatement of that commitment, but probably caveated with, but there are particular security challenges where we will need to work with partners because there are capacity gaps. Now that's a long way short of having an Article 5 type obligation, to come to the defence of an ally, but it does create some obligations. So I do think we do need to think about how much flexibility there is in a concept like neutrality, and have that debate in the public.
Let's speak a little bit about Irish security as a concept. For instance, when you mentioned capacity, how is this capacity aligned with strategic ambitions, which we might outline in some debates? As you said, it's not 100% clear what sort of capacity or how the capacity should be measured. That might be a problem. But still, as you debate with your colleagues and experts, what's missing or what's there that you consider as important to mention so we can better understand the capacity of the Irish forces?
Yeah, so at the moment, one of the main challenges is something that's quite common to most Western militaries, which is retention and recruitment. So the Irish Defence Forces, small as they are in terms of their establishment, are operating far below what that establishment figure is, because they're having difficulties bringing people in at the start and holding on to seasoned professionals. That's being addressed in some ways by changes to pay and allowances, but it's also in part the challenge that the Defence Forces have a little bit of an existential crisis in terms of what exactly are they for. That's probably going to become even more pronounced in the coming years as the UNIFIL mission, which looks like it's going to wrap up in 2027 based on its current mandate, And that was sort of one of the mainstays of your rotation if you were a member of the Irish Defence Forces in the Army, but even cadets from the Navy and Air Corps would serve on that mission as well. Given the relative lack of similar missions in the pipeline through the UN system, and given the problems in the UN Security Council, it's unlikely we're going to see those at that scale again. It means it's very difficult to argue to create sufficient professional pathways within the Irish military to retain good professionals when they're in, because after a year or two of basic training, you want to move up. You want to be able to go and apply your knowledge, develop further, develop your soldiering, and move on. So that's one pillar, which is just the personnel problem. And that's, as I said, I think quite common to a lot of Western militaries. The second is equipment capabilities. So we had as I mentioned, the Commission on Defence report, and it outlined three levels of ambition for Ireland's capabilities. One, it said business as usual, which was level of ambition one, which would in effect mean Ireland has no capacity to defend itself in the short term. Level of ambition two was seen as sort of a minimum standard to bring the Irish Defence Forces up to having some operational capability in terms of security and defence. And then level of ambition three was described as sort of a peer European nation. The commitment in most of the manifestos and in the current programme for government was for level of ambition two, and that is about procuring fairly basic things like a primary military radar. So at the moment, we don't know what's in our skies. We're reliant on the British or the French to have the courtesy to tell us if they've detected something that's of interest, and we also don't have the capability to respond to that. We don't have jets in our Air Corps. We don't have anything that's fast enough to have an intercept capability. There is an unacknowledged understanding with the British government that if something needs to be intercepted in our skies, the RAF will do so. But there's some discussion as to whether we should be developing our own capability, or at the very least, putting that understanding out as a formal public agreement, so that we recognise here's what we pay in, this is what we get, this is what it would cost us. Similarly, in terms of our naval capacity, remarkably being an island, our navy has for a very long period been underfunded. We've made some improvements in terms of our vessel fleet. So we've 4 fairly modern ships. We've got 2 intercoastal boats that we've procured from the New Zealand Navy as well. But the problem is personnel. We're reduced to being able essentially to have 1 ship operational at any one time and 1 on standby at the naval base, which, given our extensive exclusive economic zone, really doesn't present any sort of deterrent capacity for whether that's illicit shipments of drugs, illegal fishing, interference with undersea infrastructure. And so there's a sort of a desire to address that by getting more ships to sea, by improving recruitment, but it's a medium to long-term project. And that's why we're engaging with things like the NATO initiatives on undersea infrastructure and exploring possibilities through PESCO as well to develop some technological solutions to that through the use of unmanned underwater vehicles and so on.
And when you research the society, is there a willingness to put more money to military, to army, and to build something? Or is there sort of rational debate, maybe we don't need that, maybe we can invest in different areas and improve the economy or living standards or housing crisis or something like that? How is it?
So I think, again, like most Western states, that if you ask voters to rank public spending, housing, healthcare, maybe education to a certain degree would come at the top, and defence will be fairly low down. And I think Ireland isn't unusual in that. The problem in the Irish case is that the base level of defence spending has been so low. It's sunk to, I think, a minimum of about 0.27 of GDP. Over the last couple of budgets, that's improved, but it's still a commitment to bring spending up to something that would still be below 1% of GDP, which, given the gaps in our capabilities, it would take a very long time for us to catch up to a similar sized European nation. And there is a political conundrum there in that it's not particularly popular. in Ireland, if you're aware, in the general social setting, yes, we've high employment numbers. It's, people are doing well in that sense, but we do have a high housing crisis, large numbers of unhoused people, and a big gap between people's capacity to earn and translate that into even property rental or property ownership. So if you ask people that we're going to take some money away from the provision of housing in order to improve defence, which is an abstract payoff. It's like having an alarm system on your home. It may or may not be doing any good, but you'll invest that because it's an insurance policy. So it's easy for defence to slip down, and absent of some clear and obvious threat, that opinion is unlikely to change, in my view.
Do you see any movement coming from private sector? Because we know Ireland as a state or country, that's basically the first target for many companies to establish a branch or headquarters in Ireland. And I'm thinking, maybe that Ukraine crisis and war in Ukraine might put some sort of idea. Let's develop something. Let's establish some company in Ireland from different investors. Do you see any movement in that area or not really?
Specifically in the defense realm?
Yeah, defense, yeah.
Yeah. There's a small industrial base here. It's largely dual-use technologies, largely in the tech sector. So it's using chips that can be used for multiple purposes, including weapon systems. There's some development in drone technology as well. But there isn't a defense industrial policy upon which that would be based. And until very, very recently, the Industrial Development Agency, which would be the government agency responsible for attracting FDI, would not have made overtures to defense companies. And partly that, again, goes back to the public opinion piece and the public attitude that there's an anti-militarism underpinning that. There's a sort of sense that the defense industry is by its very nature suspect and not something we should be attracting. There has been some shifts to acknowledge that there's scope there, and particularly with the European Defence Fund, and the new developments in terms of developing the European Defence Industrial Base. So I think those opportunities are being seen now, and there is a little bit more lobbying in that direction, but it remains a difficult sell to the Irish public, and something that tends to raise a lot of political questions.
We also see Ireland as a center or a hub of critical infrastructure. And we can speak about energy, about data cables, about internet, and whatever cables and ports and airports are in Ireland. How do you see the acknowledgement of this infrastructure as something very important to protect, to safeguard? Because as you mentioned, the external powers, external elements are changing, and the situation with security is also changing. So do you see any impact coming from politicians or even experts that we really must protect that critical infrastructure, and therefore that new strategy must count with higher budget, with more people, more equipment, because it's impossible to protect something which is developing with something that is not developing?
Yes, so there has been a significant shift in that area. One is the establishment of the National Cybersecurity Centre and a director of cybersecurity attached to that, and that director has also been made a part of the Ministerial Council on Security and Defence, which was established in March of this year. So there's definitely an acknowledgement at official level that this is something that needs to be addressed. As I mentioned, that's also why we're part of the NATO initiative around the protection of subsea infrastructure, and exploring certain options in PESCO as well. And that's coming from demand from the private sector, because obviously if we're marketing ourselves internationally as a data center hub or as a hub for various parts of the digital economy, we need to be able to protect that infrastructure at a very basic level and give people assurances that if they come and operate here, they will remain to have reliable connectivity. So that part of it, I think, is reasonably well covered, and there's definitely a recognition and investment, and the new maritime security strategy that will be published maybe later this year or early next year, I would expect will address quite a lot of that. The second part of that I think it will address is the energy question, and there are two aspects to that. One is the potential threat to new energy infrastructure as we move to offshore wind and things like that. These are areas, again, which suddenly become a point of vulnerability and need to be looked at. And the other is our energy interconnectors, both in terms of bringing generated electricity in, whether that's from the UK or the new interconnector with France that's going to come online, but also the gas interconnectors, where about 70% of our gas comes through our pipelines from Scotland. And I think in those spaces, there hasn't been as much attention or thought, because those are areas which are primarily of national interest rather than of concern of large scale multinationals or the data cables that are transiting our exclusive economic zone and heading on towards continental Europe. And I think that's an area where we need to develop more of our own indigenous capability to provide some protection and oversight for that infrastructure.
To what degree is all that we mentioned, the security, infrastructure, different industries, and all that equipment that the Ireland needs, coordinated under unified strategy at the moment, as there is no official strategy? Like, do you see some sort of like unified movement from the politicians, from the policymakers, or do you see some sort of disagreements and might be a problem in the future?
I think it's mostly ad hoc at the moment. So you've had a couple of structures being stood up and taken down. So I mentioned the National Security Analysis Centre, the National Cybersecurity Centre, the new Ministerial Commission on Security and Defence, or Committee on Security and Defence. And then there's overlapping responsibilities from the Department of Energy, the Department of Defence, Department of Foreign Affairs, even Department of Trade and Transport will come in there as well. So there is a lack of having a clear coordination on how we respond to these issues. And what you find then is that there are perhaps initiatives coming from different directions that are picked up without necessarily connecting between them. It's not so much a case of infighting or people protecting their own turf, but it's just that lack of having an overarching security infrastructure that ties these things together. Something which I think would really need to be underpinned by a clear strategy, a national security strategy published. So hopefully that's what these moves will start to address and start to pull them in as a comprehensive as a comprehensive or integrated approach to our security in these spaces.
Some people might critically point out that Ireland and the European Union should cooperate much more deeply, especially when we speak about PESCO, Parliament Structure Cooperation, and Ireland as a part of the EU's common security and defense policy. Can you please explain, because I know this is your area of expertise, how deeply is Ireland connected to the EU structures, and is there opportunity to do more? Or this is basically the ceiling that was reached and we can't do more, basically because of institutional arrangements?
Could answer that in a couple of different ways. let's just sort of think it through. So in terms of CSDP, as it was originally sort of put together, if we're looking back to sort of the early 2000s and the first deployment missions and things like that, that period of CSDP, Ireland found it very easy to engage with because it was doing peacekeeping, some slight peace enforcement missions under UN Security Council approval. It was that kind of deployment. It was fine. They tended to be time limited. And even the extended engagements, like we've been in Althea in Bosnia-Herzegovina since 2004. So that was very much in line with Ireland's practice of external security engagement, from the very beginning. As the European Defence Agency, PESCO, CARD, and so on, as these structures became more embedded in the European system, became more institutionalised, I think that's where some of the tensions that have emerged between Ireland's traditional stance of military neutrality and the emerging EU structures have started to come to the fore. Now, Ireland has engaged positively with those. It's stepped up its engagement with PESCO since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, extending its involvement in different projects. But it doesn't lead any particular project on its own. It tends to either be a participant or an observer. And we've yet to see the fruits of any of that labour really emerge. And part of the issue there is, I suppose, a political reticence to be seen to be moving too close to that defence industrial base, to be spending too much money on armaments, to be being seen as being part of a sort of Western military force that might be used in ways that the Irish public would not be comfortable with. So we've been very selective in the kinds of engagement that we made, and even see that in response to Ukraine, where we won't fund ammunition, but we will fund helmets or flak jackets or something like that. There are those distinctions being made at the micro level, and I think until there is a change in political will, I think that probably is as far as we'll go, and we'll find ourselves left behind to some extent from that common European industrial base, even in areas where we've identified a need, but we might be reluctant to fully engage with that. The Naval Patrol Corvette is probably a good example of that, where that project was set up under PESCO, and Ireland stayed off as an observer, even having previously identified the need for a new flagship with a multi-role capability, where this was an obvious potential good fit. But there's a lot of wariness about making those commitments by the Irish government, either in terms of the amount they would cost, or the perceived political cost of tying ourselves to Western military structures. And that's the paradox of Ireland's position. In terms of economic structures, sure, we're fine. Military structures, there's a certain level of resistance at the level of the public.
Can you imagine to have EU soldiers or EU military equipment helping Ireland to protect itself?
I could imagine it, but I think that would be a tricky sell. And really what would determine the outcome of discussions on that would be what the quid pro quo is. Is this a case of where we're doing this because we're making a financial contribution, or is this a case of, well, will there be Irish soldiers helping an EU state provide for its own security? And I think the Irish public is very far away from making that sort of commitment, or supporting that kind of commitment. That would be seen as a move to militarization and the formal joining of a military alliance. I think in pragmatic terms, though, when we sit down and we analyse where the gaps are in Ireland's capabilities, where the vulnerabilities are, whether that's to our subsea infrastructure, hybrid and informational threats, and to our airspace, even if we wanted to take full responsibility for those ourselves, it's going to take 5, 10, 15 years to go through the procurement, the building up of forces, all of those requirements. And therefore, there's an intermediate gap, regardless of your long-term position on a strategic orientation, where some kind of pragmatic cooperation has to come in. And I think that's where there is scope for greater engagement with EU structures.
Because when I spoke with some scholars from different parts of the world, they were surprised that Ireland is not used as sort of EU military base because of its strategic position. It is great position when it comes to military equipment like radar, some sort of reserve forces, or those forces with the fast deployment. So how do you see this? That maybe in EU should be a debate how to use Ireland in much more pragmatic and effective way as well.
Well, I think the EU doesn't have those forces yet, so we'll have to wait and see where they might deploy them. And I think that is where you would see a lot of resistance in terms of public opinion. I mean, not to go too far back into history, but one of the origins of Ireland's military neutrality was the return of what were known as the treaty ports by the United Kingdom, which was 3 seaports that were still occupied by the Royal Navy after Ireland had formally received gained its independence. They were returned in 1938. Is the short version to Irish jurisdiction and Irish control, and I think it would be very difficult for an Irish government to sell the use of Irish military facilities by other military powers in that way. Now, that said, you can look at Shannon and the way in which its relationship to the US Air Force is somewhat ambiguous, in the sense that it's not a military base, it's not a base for the US Air Force, but it's certainly used as a staging post quite regularly by them, transporting troops, officially not transporting munitions, but there's some debate as to how effective any inspection regime might be in that context. It's generally taken at face value that if they'll declare what they're carrying, and if it's in line with Irish legislation, then it's passed through. So we've tended to have that a pragmatic approach to that. I think is probably the way to put it, but only where there's enough constructive ambiguity to allow a government to say, well, this isn't a military base. Whether that will be sufficient for European partners if there was a serious escalation in the near future, that's where that debate could really be pushed to the fore. But you're correct in that the absence of our own capability begs that question. Obviously, it would be different if we were able to provide that kind of security on behalf of our European partners ourselves, but we're clearly not at the moment. And therefore, I think it's a legitimate question for people to ask.
We spoke about the role of Ireland and NATO, the European Union and other partners, but traditionally, still Ireland and the United States, they have very strong ties. So how is these relations reflected in the new or potential security strategy of Ireland?
That's an excellent question. I mean, we've had a long-standing close relationship with the United States. That's not to say it's always been the case. If you go back to the Second World War, the US ambassador in Ireland was deeply critical of our neutral stance, and there were some tensions in that direction. But since the end of the Second World War and through the Cold War and beyond, we've had a very positive relationship with the US. In terms of security, that relationship has been, I suppose, relatively limited because we weren't formally involved in NATO. There was, I think I mentioned in the first part of the interview, an offer by Ireland for a bilateral security arrangement with the United States that was politely turned down. Let's put it like that. And really, in terms of contributing to the US strategic interests in that period, our biggest contribution has been the use of Shannon Airport, which is an airport in the west of Ireland. It's used as a layover and refueling point for the US to access, particularly its bases in Europe and the Middle East. And that's been the site of some controversy in Ireland as well. There have been protests about that, particularly during the Iraq War, and again now, with accusations that there's military materials being transferred through Shannon on its way to Israel, which is quite controversial in that context. What we've recognised, I think, as with many other European countries over the past decade or so, is that US contribution or underpinning of European security can't be taken for granted. And Ireland has tried to maintain that position as a bridge. So we see our relationship with the US as being very important, particularly for economic security, and our relationship with the European Union for both practical security means and for economic security as well. And so we try to avoid antagonising the United States in that in that context, while recognising that the domestic sort of political acceptance of that is becoming a harder sell, given the wide divergence in terms of values between the current US administration and what will be the mainstream of opinion in Ireland when it comes to questions of immigration, social rights, culture, and so on. So it's seen as a challenge, but at the moment, it's been business as usual. We're maintaining that tight relationship. Just as an example, the Irish Open, which is the largest golf tournament that's held on the island, is going to be at Donald Trump's golf course that he owns in the west of Ireland, not far from Shannon Airport that I mentioned already. And our government have said explicitly Donald Trump would be very welcome to come and attend in those circumstances. And the priority from a government perspective is to maintain that relationship as closely as possible, even though it doesn't have a formal, underpinning in terms of a defence pact or anything like that.
And as a researcher, do you see any unused potential or some sort of room to improve these relations? Or do you think that Ireland has done as much as possible and there is no room to do anything more, or there is no room for new projects or some initiatives?
I think as long as Ireland stays outside of NATO structures, I think we've probably exploited this relationship as much as we can. We don't provide an enormous amount to the United States that it wouldn't already get from either using Northern Ireland, as part of the UK, as a member of NATO, or going through Iceland or through France. The continued engagement with the use of Shannon it's useful for the United States, but it's not critical. So I don't think Ireland has any major levers it can pull in order to bring the United States closer. So I think we've done probably as much as we can in terms of that relationship, without formally entering, NATO security structures, and that would then open up greater potential when it comes to both capabilities and particularly in the intelligence sphere as well, because we don't have access to Five Eyes, we don't have access to some of that material, and that would remove a major blind spot, I think, in Ireland's vision of what its security threat environment is.
Due to some very attractive incentives, Ireland is usually considered as a good destination for business. And business creates infrastructure, and this digital infrastructure is connected to financial services worldwide. And we know that when we go to social media, when we doing business with international partners, many times there is an element from Ireland. So in regarding cybersecurity and infrastructure security, how is the new strategy position in this regarding the security, and also being ready for the future attacks or possible hybrid attacks regarding hacking? We know about attacks from countries like North Korea, in the United States, targeting banks and financial institutions. So we have some experience. But what about Ireland and this area?
Yeah, there's been a significant shift in perception in that area, particularly at the policy level. Probably the major catalyst for that was back during COVID. We had a major cyber attack on the health service that essentially took all of our digital health records offline, reduced the capacity of our hospitals to function. As you can imagine, in the middle of handling a pandemic, this was less than ideal, and it took some time to get that back on track. Interestingly, that if you look at the public debate around that wasn't securitized. It wasn't discussed as a sort of a hostile actor taking place, even though we would have strong suspicions as to where the group, they were, private hackers, but they were very certainly based in a hostile country and operating probably with government knowledge. So there has been a shift as a result of that. So we've established a National Cybersecurity Centre. We've appointed a Director of Cybersecurity as well. There's been greater investment in cybersecurity capabilities within the Irish state as well. So they're starting to move on that and trying to leverage, through Partnership for Peace with NATO partners and through the European Union as well, the support of other partners to get access to expertise and best practice in this area. Similarly with subsea infrastructure, between data centres being based in Ireland, connected to major social media and other digital companies here, there's a question of cyber espionage around pharma as well. And then there is the transiting of major parts of the international subsea cable network infrastructure through the Irish Exclusive Economic Zone as well. There's a recognition that that's an issue. There has been some engagement by the government with private actors to use drone surveillance and similar to keep an eye on that, but also more engagement with partners through NATO and through the European Union as well, to try and leverage their capabilities in that space. What I'd say is where the situation is at the moment is there's increased recognition. There are some countermeasures being put in place, but there's probably a recognition that we're still a long way off being able to make a sort of to feel comfortable in the cyberspace. I think Irish systems are still quite vulnerable, and we've seen that recently with attacks on third level institutions. Two of the colleges in Ireland had significant attacks, taking them offline for prolonged periods, and we could expect that level of attack to continue in the medium term at least, without there being a significant sort of countermeasure. There is, though, some cyber preparedness being brought in, and companies are now expected to have, as part of their risk register, questions about resilience and continuity plans in the event of major cyber attacks. So there's greater recognition, there are greater resources, but as with all of these times, it'll take time until those resources match the level of threat and risk that we're facing. And particularly when it comes to subsea infrastructure, we're quite a long way from addressing the risks there.
There is one element that I can criticize a little bit, and that's that I'm missing a bit more promotion or presentation of the Irish cybersecurity sector especially when you have those open conferences. So it doesn't mean to reveal like how everything is structured in Ireland, like what sort of measures you apply, but the conference. The mission is also to show the hackers and those who potentially would like to attack Ireland that, hey, we're doing something and we're doing some clever steps. So, this is sort of a kind of deterrence, we can say. Do you agree with this, or just my subjective observation?
No, I think you have a point. I'm kind of reminded of the Dr. Strangelove and the Doomsday Machine. Is that the whole point of deterrence is to tell them that you have the device. And if you are taking these steps, we could probably make more of it. I think those messages are being sent through trade conferences. So it's when, it's very much with our economic hat on. We tend to think about these things and reassuring those major technology companies or pharma companies who are based in Ireland for a variety of different reasons. Let's put it like that. That they will be safe and secure, and their data will be secure, and they'll be able to operate on that basis. I think the tension in terms of these being sort of larger public events, and particularly flagging our engagement with the NATO Centre of Excellence, or with even with EU partners, is politically that's a fraught question here. And that if you start to have conferences with security in the label, you tend to meet opposition very, very quickly. And the security culture here, I think, at a political level, is do as much as you can without drawing attention, as much as possible. And only kind of when you're forced to bring it out to have a public debate, just because there tends to be a lot of heat and not a lot of light in those debates. So I think I can see from the Irish perspective why there isn't a lot of sort of shouting from the rooftops that we're engaged in these strategies. But I also would agree with you that can be a problem, in part for the deterrence reason, as you identified, but also just the general public awareness of threat. And I'd go back to that attack on the health system, which was really quite severe. It could have had much more far-reaching consequences than it did. They responded quite well and managed to get operational systems back online, or at least operational workarounds back online quite quickly. But that could happen again. It could happen with our air traffic control centres. It could happen with our marine traffic control systems. And, we sometimes need to remind people that we're an island, and we're deeply, deeply dependent on these systems for the food we put on our table and the jobs that we go to every day. So I think in some cases, a healthier public debate around security would be useful.
The next chapter is United Nations. As we mentioned, Ireland has limited defense and offense capabilities, but still is a significant voice in the United Nations due to history, due to diaspora, which is spread across the world. So how do you see the position of Ireland regarding security in the United Nations, especially when we speak about peacekeeping missions?
Yeah, so I think there's probably three levels of our engagement in the UN system that are worth talking about. And I think we've seen since we joined the UN, we were initially held back because the Soviet Union opposed our membership. We saw ourselves having a key role in non-proliferation, and we were sort of instrumental in negotiating the initial NPT, and have been strong supporters of that ever since. The second strand is we made a conscious effort to be an engaged member of the United Nations. One of our rolling goals is membership with the Security Council on roughly a sort of 10 to 15 year basis as one of the non-permanent members. Not all countries do that and put in the efforts to put that around. And then the third strand of that is peacekeeping. And this is sort of a recognition, right, going back to UNEF, which was the first UN mission that went into Egypt in 1956. Ireland had volunteered that it would be willing to send troops. We weren't required at that point, but we were sent to the first observation mission in Lebanon in what became UNIFIL, and have had a presence in that mission essentially ever since, sometimes with greater numbers, sometimes with fewer numbers as the years went by. And so it's been a key part of our identity as an international actor. And that helped to fulfill a couple of roles. One, domestically, it was very much in line with Irish attitudes to foreign policy towards international organisation, the importance of international law, which is a rational approach for a relatively small state. We need these systems to work because they're a multiplier of our voice on the international stage. It also quite crucially, I suppose, gave our military something to do. So, we weren't a NATO member. We weren't involved in those kind of military maneuvers. We weren't involved in offensive military operations in any sense. And sort of the saying within the Irish Defence Forces is that, everybody who joins has 2 good years. You have the first year where it's all new and you're doing your first training and getting up to speed. And then you have your second year when you get to go abroad on an international mission, usually to the Lebanon. So most Irish soldiers would have served there because it's been consistently the larger mission in the field at the moment. And so it's played an important part in both retention and in sort of morale within the Irish Defence Forces, and giving them a sense of learning about operating in a contested strategic environment, learning how to manoeuvre, doing the basics of soldiery that you've done on the training ground so many times, and being able to apply that in the real world and bring those lessons back in. It's also maintained a high level of popular support, even in cases where we've had loss of life. We've had over 40 soldiers killed on the UNIFIL mission, largest single loss of life on the Congo mission back in 1961, with the ambush at Niemba. So there were significant parts where we might have expected a little bit of pushback from the public as to what are we doing in these far-flung places. But that never came, and there's always maintained a strong support for Ireland's involvement in peacekeeping, because it's seen as very much aligned with our identity as a nation in the international sphere, where we're anti-colonial, we're in favour of human rights, we're encouraging peace, and our soldiers are doing a positive contribution in relation to that. So it's been almost a truism of Irish foreign and security policy across different governments that we would take up those opportunities. Now, that has become something of a controversy in the last year or so, where the decisions on deployment for Irish troops abroad, I suppose, what's not unusual is that we require parliamentary approval. So there's a parliamentary lock on that. But what is unusual is that since 1960, we've only been, legislatively been allowed to deploy troops abroad in numbers greater than 12 if there's a UN Security Council resolution. Out of recent debates on Irish security, particularly the consultative forum that took place 2 years ago, a proposal has emerged to remove the so-called triple lock, which is to remove the UN Security Council resolution requirement. The government's argument for that is, well, one, there hasn't been a new mission mandated since 2014 by the UN Security Council. That's been bolstered by the decision to end the UNIFIL mission by 2027, recently by the Security Council. So they're pointing to the fact that, well, the landscape of peacekeeping is changing and these peace operations are changing, and we want to maintain kind of sovereign authority in deciding when we want to deploy troops abroad, and not be beholden to whether that's Moscow or Beijing or Washington or particularly London, for a variety of reasons, in deciding when we might send troops abroad. But that's been seen by opposition parties as an attempt to remove by stealth our traditional policy of military neutrality. So there's a little bit of tension between the very strong tradition of peacekeeping and its future, and those who see the removal of a UN Security Council involvement in that as being an attempt to dilute neutrality.
I left the last question, or one of the last questions, at the end, and because it's the most sensitive one, and that's the relation between North and the South. So you, as Ireland, you are basically between London, Brussels, and international community regarding the Northern Ireland. And it's still not that clear what's going on, what will be in the future. There was a Brexit, there was a lot of discussion about the border, how to handle the security, and still we have some, is something going to happen or not? So how is this reflected in the possible new strategy? And perhaps you have some thoughts to share about the Northern Ireland and the Ireland security issues.
I think there's a couple of really interesting dynamics there. One, in terms of the debate around the national security strategy and the maritime security strategy, perhaps counterintuitively, I don't think Northern Ireland is going to be a major element in that. And that reflects a major shift in Irish security orientation. One of the reasons we sort of forgot we were an island is that the main security threat to the state was the internal threat from subversives, particularly the IRA and to a lesser extent, the potential for loyalists to operate on a cross-border basis. So the main focus of Irish security practice and the way we had oriented our military structures and our counterintelligence structures was dealing with the consequences of the conflict on our island, particularly in Northern Ireland. With the Good Friday Agreement in place, that threat has significantly diminished. It hasn't entirely gone away. There are still sort of splinter groups on the Republican side and still some activity on the loyalist side as well. So there are still security risks there, but it's not at the level where it's of any consequence to the security of the state. Essentially, it's sort of it's a low level terrorist threat on that basis. What has been missing, I think, in the debate, and even post Brexit, where the question of Irish unity has come back on the table, is any real serious consideration of what the security implications of that are. And there's a couple of aspects to that. One is it brings the internal security question very firmly back to the fore, because even though if there is a question of reunification, it will be through the ballot box, it will be through an open vote in Northern Ireland, but that would still leave a significant constituency who might not be that happy about the new political situation. And if that vote is unsuccessful and Northern Ireland votes to remain to keep the status quo, that might give some impetus to on the Republican side, on the national side, to return to paramilitary activity. So there's that challenge, which is we could have a significant internal security threat from loyalist or Republican paramilitaries. The second challenge then is, what does that do strategically to the Ireland of Ireland from NATO's perspective? So particularly if you look at both the First and Second World Wars, Lough Swilly, which is sort of between Derry and Donegal up in the north, between the Republic and Northern Ireland, that was a crucial deep water base for the North Atlantic submarine fleet. It was an important part of protecting transatlantic trade routes in the context of the Second World War. Losing that from a NATO perspective in the event of a global conflagration would be serious. So would there be pressure on Ireland, if unity is on the table, to reconsider its strategic orientation, to talk about moving back towards NATO? And we can see some echoes of that in the Scottish independence debate. Again, because the nuclear submarine fleet is based in Scotland. So there was some discussion about what would happen to those bases. Would an independent Scotland be a NATO member, and so on? And I think there are similar implications in the Irish case that haven't fully been thought through, because of the expanded exclusive economic zone. We'd be responsible for the expanded security challenges, looking up to the north as well as to the west and the south, as we do at the moment. So there are really big issues there that we need to think about carefully, and they're not really a part of the debate. It's at the moment the debate is focused on the culture symbolism element. Do we need a new flag and a new anthem? And the economic cost, which is Northern Ireland's economy is significantly weaker than the Irish economy, significantly more dependent on essentially state transfers from Westminster, and would Dublin have the financial capacity to take those on? But I think there's a third part of that debate that doesn't get enough attention and probably should.
There is also one simple question, usually coming from people outside of the European Union, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and that's, what's the situation with terrorists in the Northern Ireland? Because as you said, there was the agreement. At the moment, we didn't hear about attacks or some potential attacks, but still some people are wondering what's going on in this area, and if there is any debate about the terrorism in Northern Ireland, or this has ended as well.
I wouldn't say it has ended, but it's greatly diminished. So the IRA are no longer a significant security threat in terms of having operational capabilities. They don't have stockpiles of weapons or explosives. They don't have, the training and command and control structures that they had in place. Those have largely withered on the vine to a greater or lesser degree. On the Republican side, there are small splinter groups, but they are small. They have sort of historically been well infiltrated by our security services or the British security services, and haven't been able to mount significant attacks. Where many of them have moved towards is involvement in ordinary criminal activity. So if you look at drugs or those kind of areas, smuggling of cigarettes and so on. Now that there's a customs border to exploit again, in those areas you will find ex-paramilitaries or those involved with the new splinter paramilitary groups at that level. So at the moment, it wouldn't be a high level of threat, certainly on the Republican side. On the Unionist side, the structures are a little bit more in place. But again, the capabilities aren't there, and to a certain degree, the Unionist terrorist groups were never quite as operationally effective. They were more sort of localized and focused on policing their own communities, and things like that. And where there is, I suppose, an uptick in activity is you probably have seen the violence in relation to immigrants in different parts of Northern Ireland over the last year or so, in response to claims about sexual assault and so on, similar to what's been happening in other parts of England. But Unionist and our loyalist paramilitaries have been in the background very much involved in orchestrating some of that. So there is still that kind of issue. And even in the last week or two, there has been some targeting of Catholics living in the Protestant area. So that low level of activity is still present. But as I said, I wouldn't expect that to flare up unless there was a vote on unity, and those groups suddenly found that their constitutional position was going to change, and they'd be answerable to a Dublin government and not to a London government. But at the moment, I mean, within the parameters any of these things are successful, I think we can look at the Irish peace process and say it has done what it hoped to do, which is take the gun out of politics and the bomb out of politics. And those, while there's still disagreement and lots of frustrating engagement across the two communities, they're doing that through political means and not through violent means.
The last question for today's interview, Professor McDonagh. From academic perspective, is there any under-researched area regarding Irish security that might be attractive for junior researchers or maybe some of our colleagues that are listening to this interview, and maybe something that you would recommend to have a look for the potential projects in the future?
One area which is somewhat remarkably under-researched, and I'll call myself guilty for this, is our involvement in non-proliferation. There is, to my knowledge, nobody in an Irish university working on that exclusively, much to the annoyance of our Department of Foreign Affairs, because they spend quite a lot of time and effort on it and have done for decades. So I do think if someone was interested in why a small country would be involved in these kind of questions and what kind of leverage they might have, I think you'd be pushing against an open door and have lots of resources and material that you could engage with. On the other side, in terms of one of the other questions I think is worth asking, and I'm not aware of anyone doing any significant study on this, is the almost complete absence of a maritime security orientation in Ireland. And the great example I would give of that, when we gained independence from the United Kingdom, the Royal Navy maintained control of 3 ports because they were using them as naval bases. In the 1930s, we had what we called an economic war with Britain over a couple of issues, but one of which was these ports, and they were returned to Irish sovereign control in 1938. I've read the cabinet minutes surrounding this and the Defence Council minutes, and there was no strategic planning to take over these naval bases. So we entered the Second World War without a navy, despite 2 years earlier having gained control of these significant naval facilities. And that was sort of been the case for the Navy over the period of independence. And it's a really curious question, because one of the things I always get asked, and I've spent time in Central Europe, is what's our Navy like? We must have an impressive one, being an island nation on the edge of the Atlantic, and we don't. There's some plans to improve that, but it's an interesting question to dig into.
Professor McDonagh, many thanks for your time, for sharing your research insight with us. I think, as you said, it's a small country, but it's a very interesting country in many security matters. from cybersecurity to maritime security and others. I think some people might be interested in researching Irish security, and I'm very happy that we could record this episode to spread a word. So again, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
My pleasure, Martin. Thanks very much.